Again, the next evolution, this electric vehicle revolution that we're in is happening fast. It's just interesting as we have had a front row seat.
Welcome to Prime Lunchtime with Brian Johnson, a monthly podcast featuring the city manager and your host, Rico Figliolini. Taking the conversation beyond just talk, it's about getting the facts, discussing the issues, and asking honest questions of our city.
Hi, everyone. This is Rico Figliolini, host of Peachtree Corners Live, and today, Prime Lunchtime with City Manager Brian Johnson. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Appreciate you making time for me today. I know that you are at a very important meeting, so we'll get into that. I just want to say to everyone here that this is brought to you by Peachtree Corners Magazine, sponsor of this and our other podcasts. We're looking forward to working on our next issue that you'll be seeing. So if you're interested in sending us nominations, by the way, for the Faces of Peachtree Corners, our deadline is March 1st. So check out our website. It's on there. It'll tell you 12 and up and the type of nominee we're looking for, and we'll be sorting through that after March 1st. So feel free to find someone that's 12 years old and older that has an impact on our community in some way, whether they're a business owner here or live here and have commitment maybe through their school, maybe their athleticism, maybe technology, nonprofit work. Let us know, and we'd love to share that in our next issue. So now that I've said that, let's get on with the show, if you will, because plenty to talk about. And the first thing probably would be where you came from. Tell us a bit about that, about a company that we all know is in Peachtree Corners, but we didn't know how big of a presence they really have based on what we're doing here. So talk about that a little bit.
So just got back from, like you said, Rico, sometimes the surprising things that are happening right underneath your daily activity, right underneath your nose. I was just at a big unveiling event from who is currently, at least, our largest employer, and that's Siemens. People do know that Siemens has had a presence here that predates even the city's birth.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I believe they've had a large presence here. I think they said 2004. The event was for Siemens to unveil a new electric vehicle charging system that was created and developed here in Peachtree Corners.
It's unique in some ways, if I understand correctly.
It is.
And they've been putting it out or releasing it in some way, I think in Germany and Australia, if this is the same system that I'm thinking about.
It is. There are some unique stuff. Some of the simple unique things are all the material is recycled material. So there's a sustainability part. And then it's an AC, not a DC charger. Of course, on the AC chargers, they're slower. That's generally what you have at home. It's almost like a trickle charger. It takes many hours to charge your vehicle all the way up. So it's not a DC fast charger, but the reason it's a big deal is DC fast chargers are expensive and they take a lot of power. And this is an AC, but instead, most AC ones right now are about 7 kilowatt, and this is 14. So it doubles that. So it's going to decrease the full charging time using these type of chargers in half. And it's got some other technology. And again, the next evolution, this electric vehicle revolution that we're in is happening fast. It's just interesting as we have had a front row seat on this stuff, both because of Curiosity Lab and because of the companies that are corporate tenants here, like Siemens. We got a chance to experience it. So we were invited to be part of this event. Mayor had some remarks. We were joined by one of our public service commissioners, a great friend of the city, Vice Chair Commissioner Tim Eccles. Our U.S. Representative Carolyn Bordeaux was here, and then the CEO of Siemens North America and the head of all of Siemens Global Smart City and Global eMobility. And what we didn't realize, what the city didn't realize, and we knew Siemens was here. They have a large presence here. It's ironic that the buildings, some of the buildings they moved out of, they just basically relocated a mile down the road about a year and a half ago. They were on Triangle Parkway. They left those buildings and they moved over to Parkway Lane and Jaybird Alley.
Staying in the city versus choosing moving out of the city.
Great point. So they stayed here. They have just under 600 employees in the city. So currently they're the largest employer. The irony I was going to say is the buildings they moved out of, Intuitive bought, and Intuitive's moving either into some of them or they're demoing them, and that's the site that they'll build the new buildings on.
Right.
Anyway, two great corporate tenants of the city, but Siemens is, of course, their headquarters is in Berlin. They're a German company, but their headquarters for global mobility is here in Peachtree Corners.
Yeah, and the city didn't know about this really.
No,
right?
I mean, so all of their research and development for mobility technology devices, anything that they're creating or wanting to create is all done here. We both were kind of scratching our heads as we talked about what we're doing. And we're like, why are you not in Curiosity Lab? And they're kind of like, why are we not doing stuff in Curiosity Lab? And we're both looking at each other like, how is it that we were not? Literally, one end of Curiosity Lab is a quarter of a mile from their building. If you just go right across the street from where Marriott is, right onto Jaybird Alley, you clear the Walgreens, and then the next right after that will go to Pond.
That's right. Right.
And then the very next right after that is the Parkway Lane, and that's their building.
It's interesting how Curiosity Lab is out there and putting things out there, all the news about it and stuff. And yet, some of these people may not live here. They may not be aware of what's going on in the city like that because they're doing their work, their corporate work. This COVID in the last 2 years also has probably changed a bit of that, and maybe people are coming back, maybe it's hybrid. This whole idea we talked about before, about how this whole area of Atlanta, northern arc of Atlanta, maybe Buckhead, maybe Alpharetta for sure, and Peachtree Corners over the last few years, getting into it. And like you were saying, pound for pound, we're probably bigger per capita in technology than even Alpharetta is. This whole area, Silicon Orchard versus Silicon Valley, it's a great phrase that you guys talked about. And maybe now we can start seeing that being used, talking about the technology that's here and the companies that are here. Probably companies we still don't even know what they're doing inside because there's lots of companies here in Peachtree Corners that people don't even know about and what they do. Just to find this out, another place, another company to be taking advantage of Curiosity Lab.
And just doing great things in their own right. So what we're really liking to see here, Curiosity Lab had some degree of a role in Intuitive choosing this location. Right. So then Intuitive is going to build this headquarters, and then Siemens got all this mobility going on, all this electric vehicle, and they're also the North American headquarters for their smart facility tech. So the things they make to go inside a building, sensors to control your air and heat and lighting controls, all that kind of stuff is also done here. Intuitive was piqued when I brought it up once about Siemens having a large presence here. Siemens was very interested in discussing Intuitive more. So there's already this synergy that's starting to go on that we may not even have anything to do, but we've got two corporate tenants of the city. One is the current largest employer. The other one will become our largest employer. And they're talking about doing stuff together. And you start throwing in companies like T-Mobile, whose presence is growing at Curiosity Lab. They're starting to get some energy and synergy amongst this stuff. And that's how areas get made. That's how Silicon Valley was created, is because of companies wanting to be close to each other, working together. And pretty soon this ecosystem starts growing. It just grows upon each other.
It makes sense because they're researching. I mean, Silicon Valley grew out of Microsoft and then Apple and all these companies going there and sharing employees, sharing ideas, talking about the technology and stuff. I mean, we have ASHRAE here. They just built a net zero carbon facility. I think it was finally certified that that's what it is. So companies and associations and groups like that, just going to drive some of this technology. There's more out there that we could talk about, I'm sure, of companies similar. But this is just one step. I just saw that release come across Yahoo Wire today about Siemens and Nexel unveiling that sustainable, cost-effective electric vehicle charging prototype that they're putting out in Germany and Australia and all these places. So
developed here, created here in Peachtree Corners.
That's it. And I think when other companies talk about it, when financial institutions talk about it, when other firms that want to take advantage of the technology talk about it or partner with them, they're going to be saying based in Peachtree Corners. Hopefully, I mean, I see more of that happening. Yeah, some companies may say, based in Atlanta, because Atlanta everyone knows. But I think over time, like we discussed, Silicon Orchard is the name that we really should be in this area because of the amount of, Alpharetta has 700 companies. We have hundreds of companies as well that are high-tech companies.
And Rico, just so you know, for those who may be viewing, don't know the Silicon Orchard thing. It was about a year ago. We were on an analyst call with a bunch of tech analysts that report on tech for Wall Street. And when we got done talking about Curiosity Lab, one of the analysts was like, "This is the kind of stuff I hear when I'm talking to cities in Silicon Valley." He's like, "But you're not. You're in Georgia, and Georgia's the peach state, and there's peach orchards. Maybe you guys should be Silicon Orchard." And that started to grow legs. And so for those who haven't heard it, that's why. And it's more than just us. It would be. I mean, Silicon Orchard is not just one place. Research Triangle, North Carolina is not just one, nor with Silicon Orchard. But maybe there is something to the fact that we have a growing tech industry in various areas like fintech and others that maybe it will stick.
For sure. I think that finance companies, investors, other companies that it's interesting how marketing also wants to have a name for a place. And so maybe this is a name that's going to stick. Think about it. Hollywood had the monopoly on filmmaking for years. And then all of a sudden, yes, you would get films shot in New York and stuff, but things would be Hollywood. But then we had The Walking Dead. And then all of a sudden, because of Georgia's incentive program, which hopefully will stay in place, brought Hollywood East to Georgia. I mean, the amount of movies and TV shows made in the metro Atlanta area and outside the rest of Georgia as well is unbelievable per capita. I mean, you got Netflix.
Disney just filmed in City Hall last week for an FBI show called Class of '09 that'll be out on Hulu late summer, fall. But they just filmed in City Hall. A lot of scenes in Ozark are filmed here.
That's right. So you have Ozark filming in Technology Park area and around different areas like Jones Bridge Park and stuff.
Yep.
Netflix, HBO, Amazon. There are a whole bunch of companies, streaming companies, and production companies that film here for good reason. And no different with Silicon Orchard, that people will get to know that. And if they get to know that, then they're going to maybe want to relocate the same way Intuitive Robotics did. Makes a lot of sense to me. Now, talk about Intuitive Robotics and getting down into the city things. This is more national, bigger picture, but we also have things that go on in the city that people need to know about that are day to day. We talk about this before the show about things that affect people's lives and stuff in day to day activities. On our website, the biggest articles that get the most views are stuff like the roundabout near the Forum, that proposed roundabout there, the East Jones Bridge Trail, the sale of the Forum, which for those that don't know has been pushed back for about 2 weeks now, the purchase. Nothing in particular, but just because they're working out financials and stuff. So let's talk a little bit about Intuitive Robotics, because there was some changes in zoning or special use that some people got incorrect because they are not a manufacturing company. So let's get that settled a little bit. So give us some detail on that.
Like you said, Rico, I mean, some of this stuff, we talk in broad terms. We've been talking about Intuitive's $600 million East Coast campus being built here. And that's all great. But when you build something, when something changes, the devil is in the details. And there are a lot of details. And in this case, Intuitive has about 40 acres that they currently own. There are a lot of buildings on these 40 acres. In fact, really, all of the 40 acres they purchased were individual parcels with existing buildings already. Right. So they assembled all these parcels and they've created a master plan. And some of these buildings, so they're phasing it in. They work through, all right, we got to build this first, and then we'll move temporarily these employees over here. And then, they're doing all this stuff. So there's all these pieces moving around. But unfortunately, these are pieces where each parcel has constraints to it because it's a redevelopment. And why that's important is if somebody had bought 40 acres and they wanted to build a medical campus, there's a lot of flexibility that they would have if they had a blank slate. If it was an
Mhm.
undeveloped 40 acres and they could just master plan the whole thing where all the buildings go,
Right.
they could do it in a way that was the least impactful to surrounding, so on and so forth. In the current case with Intuitive, the assembly facility in which they are going to be assembling, not manufacturing,
Right.
but taking components that were manufactured at other places and putting them together and doing the quality control
Mhm.
component to this stuff and get them certified, because the FDA has to certify these machines. That's what's going to be done here. So it's an assembly facility. It's not a manufacturing. But anyway, the only place that they could put it, with the little game that they had to play about moving things around, was on a particular parcel
Mhm.
that is next to existing homes.
Those conditions that were originally on that parcel goes back to the 1980s, if I remember correctly.
That is correct. So in 1980, essentially, Peachtree Station started to get developed. And some of these homes along where Intuitive now owns were built. Then in 82, the parcels were rezoned, the parcels that Intuitive owns that are next to about 10 homes on the back of Peachtree Station.
Mhm.
It was rezoned M1, light manufacturing, in 1982. But then in 1987, as part of the construction of one of the buildings on this M1 zone parcel, there
Mhm.
were extra restrictions placed, extra conditions placed on some of these parcels. One of them in particular is one that Intuitive owns, and it had two specific things that were conditions that Intuitive requested a change to from 1987 to now. One is it had, instead of the normal 50-foot buffer in between
Mhm.
the residential and the M1, it had an
Mhm.
additional, really 40 feet, 30 feet of undisturbed buffer and 10 feet of a planted landscape strip. So this 90 feet, one of the things Intuitive, when they position their building, needed is a variance from a section of their road encroaching into that 90-foot buffer. They needed about 20 feet. Well, they needed 14 feet into the 90-foot buffer, and they needed to be inside of that buffer for about 20 feet. So inside the buffer for 14 feet deep, 20 feet
Right.
long.
So not the extent of the property line, just a
No,
portion of the property line.
just a corner. It was coming out of the building. It just went into the buffered area and out. So
Mhm.
they asked for a variance on that section of road.
Mhm.
And then I guess that would be the northern end of the building, one end of the building. And their assembly facility is more of a longer, narrow building
Mhm.
for a number of reasons, especially given the constraints of the property.
Right.
One end of the building encroached into this parcel that had these unique conditions. And one of the conditions in this parcel, the other thing that Intuitive needed the city to, or they requested the city to grant a variance, was on stories. So the parcel that was restricted in 87 has a stipulation in there that no buildings can be taller than 1 story,
Mm.
but it
Okay.
doesn't give an actual height. So because of that, the actual height limitation in an M1 zoning is 40 feet
Mhm.
within 150 feet of the property line. And then outside of 150 feet, it can go up to 55 feet. And then outside of 200, it can go as much as 85 feet. That's the maximum height. I only bring that up to say that the conditions were that no building could be more than 1 story, but it doesn't have a height restriction beyond the core zoning.
Okay.
Intuitive had about 70 feet of their building encroach just inside of this parcel. 4% of their building was inside of this parcel that had a restriction against anything more than 1 story. And the assembly building is 3 stories. On the end farthest away from the homes, it's only 2 stories above grade on the side of the building closest to the homes because the first floor is into the ground because
The way that the land
yeah,
is situated.
you know how it goes as you dig into
Yeah,
this. So, but it was more than one story. So they asked for a variance. And over the course of really 2 very intense weeks actually a month, I'm sorry, not 2 weeks.
Mhm.
The last 2 weeks were intense, but since the planning commission met last month until city council's vote, Intuitive had a lot of communication with the residents and made a number of improvements, enhancements, and changes to their application such that the product that they ultimately went to the city removed the request for the road to be in the buffer. They redesigned the way that traffic would circulate, and they pulled the road. They were able to pull it out of the buffer. So now they were only coming to the city for one request, and that is to vary off of the stories
Mhm.
and say, please remove the restriction against only one story because 4% of our building in this parcel is 2 stories on their side. While they were talking to the residents, there were a number of concessions and improvements that Intuitive made to try to lessen the impact of what was considered by the adjacent property owners to be, at a minimum, an additional floor height impact on them.
So what were some of those
And
conditions?
yeah, so the conditions are Intuitive. Let's start with, noise. They reduced the amount of loading bays from 10 down to 5 that are along the side of the building closest to the residents.
Okay.
The loading bays that are close to the residents are bays in which the vehicle goes all the way inside of the building and a door shuts behind them. So any of the loading is inside the building for the delivery vehicles like Amazon, FedEx, UPS. There are 2 exterior loading bays on Spalding
Mhm.
that you would have an 18-wheeler could back up and you would have essentially external loading, but that is facing Spalding, not the neighborhood. So they reduced that. They enhanced the buffer. So there is anything from 50 up to 90 feet between 10 parcels that adjoin Intuitive. 5
So
of
they
the houses are in this SUP area where they had the 90-foot enhance, and then 5 of them
Mhm.
were not. But Intuitive came in and said, look, the intent of all of that was to try to keep the impact of our operation as minimal as we can. So we are going to over plant the buffer.
Okay.
We're going to add a lot of plant material. We're going to add understory plant material because right now most of it is open. Well, most of it are pine trees like loblolly pines in which you got to be 60, 80 feet before you even have pine
Any
needle.
canopy. Yeah.
Under it, you can see right through it. They're planting shrubs for the lowest and understory trees in the middle, magnolia, that are evergreen all year round
Mm.
to shield all the way up, not just on the top levels.
Oh, neat. Okay.
So they're adding a security fence, or basically removing all the chain link fences that are on the back of the adjoining property owners and replacing it with their own new heavy gauge metal security fence that is not climbable, and it'll be 8 feet tall. And then inside of that, so that'll be on the property line, but then remember there's a buffer. So then Intuitive has to come off 50 feet for 5 of the adjoining houses and 90 feet for the other ones before they can build anything. And there's a ridge line. It's like the highest point in that area.
Yeah.
In some of the properties, there is a wooden fence that was placed there back in the day to shield maybe a little bit of noise, but mostly lights from vehicles shining into their back window. And so Intuitive is going to replace that fence all the way down and put one all the way down to tie into the rock wall that basically serves that purpose right near Spalding. So they're enhancing that. They are, let's see, what else did they agree to do? There's a maintenance bond of 3 years. They're putting money into the maintenance bond. And if there's any trees that have died 3 years after, the city will draw down off of that maintenance bond to replace all the trees. those kind of things. But they did come back and say, we still need this building to encroach into the buffer, and we don't want any height restrictions into the future because we don't know exactly what we'll do with the remainder of that parcel that has this restriction of 1 story. So the request was to just remove reference to story, because right now, or before, it said building can't be more than 1 story, and instead replaced it with building can't be higher than 40 feet. So it didn't matter how many stories inside. And their contention was, these people don't want height. Inside, does it really matter how many stories there are? It's more of, limit the height. And they did agree that they would not do anything above 40 inside of 350 feet of the property line. So they even agreed to, if they ever in the future, and they don't know what they'll do, their contention was, we haven't master planned exactly what we want to do with that particular parcel. Okay. They even talked about maybe it's green space for their employees there. Maybe it is only still 1 story, but they were like, we don't want to be limited unnecessarily before we know all of that. So they're like, look, we're prepared to push all of our stuff as far away as we can to enhance the buffer, things that they didn't have to do. Those were not requirements of theirs.
This is what companies come back and do, right? Within the compromise of getting what they want, they've done certain things. And no company wants to come back multiple times. So I can appreciate how they want to take care of what they're taking care of now to give them that freedom later.
Now, Rico, I will tell you, so that all is good, all well and good. A lot of thought went into this, a lot of back and forth, but unfortunately, when the sausage was getting made, there was a couple of things that happened. One is, Intuitive, when they were meeting with some of the residents, and some of these meetings happened without the city's involvement, they had people that were speaking on behalf of the organization about things into the future that they either didn't have the rank to do or they weren't experts in this. And so at one point, this parcel that we're talking about that had that 1 story restriction actually has a building on it. If you remember, it was about 5 years ago, we put in a big company called CGS that had a big call center in there. It's their building. And so Intuitive bought it, and they are temporarily using that facility to start assembling Da Vinci systems while they build the permanent one. As soon as they build the permanent one, they're going to move everything out of the temporary one into the new one, and then they're going to demo the current one. Right. What they didn't know is, what will you do after you demo it? And at some point, one of their teams said, if we build anything, it won't be more than 1 story, like the current building. The residents, rightly so, heard that, and they're like, okay. So when Intuitive's official application for the city council meeting came in, it had 40 feet. They asked for remove the height, or the number of stories, and just 40 feet. Right. Anything closer to, 40 feet, even though they could have always done 40 feet, in the mind of the adjacent property owners, they're like, you said 1 story like the current building, and the current building is only 23 feet high.
So that's how they got that.
Yeah. Okay. So they could, so Intuitive created their own problem by not managing expectations, instead of saying, look, we don't know. And it came up at the council meeting, and they were called out on it, and they owned it and just said, look, we spoke prematurely, and we don't know exactly what we want to do. We are happy with the restrictions of height that were in there from day one. We're prepared to keep that height restriction much deeper into the parcel, 350 feet versus 150 feet if it hadn't been. But we don't want to limit ourselves now when we don't know what will happen, and we don't want to have to go through this process again. And like you said, you get it, but then conversely, I understand how the residents feel, the adjacent residents, and I told a few of them this. Not only do I sympathize with them, but I empathize with them because I just got done going through this essentially as a resident with Waterside. Well, not just essentially. I mean, as a homeowner, my property backs up to the old Fiserv, now Waterside property. And so we went through the same thing as adjacent property owners as mine was at an area of the old Fiserv campus that didn't have any buildings. It was a very remote area. I mean, it was like they had walking trails back there. I mean, it didn't have any building. And now they're wanting to build townhomes and stacked flats in an area that had not been. And so I empathize with change. It's going to be a little bit different. There had been a 23-foot building there, and it could be 40 feet in the future as much as that. I get it. Out of it is an enhancement to that buffer that they would have never had Intuitive not felt like they needed to give something back in order to be able to say, hey, we did everything we could to impact you the least. So I appreciate how they feel. Nobody likes change. I just went through it 2 years ago. Fast forward 2 years later, I have a better buffer. It was planted with evergreens. It has very much enhanced the buffer sight lines of me having to see in there. You can't as much. We both win, essentially.
It's interesting how things have changed since I moved here in 95. We're not a seaside resort that wants to remain looking a certain way, or a historic downtown area that may want to remain small. Norcross, for example, tried to do that. And because of that, they had no activity. A lot of retail went out of business because there was no activity there. There's old-time owners of old buildings. Until they started doing some development work, they weren't able to revive that downtown area, for example. We're not saying that here, and I empathize too. I understand not wanting to have noise and stuff like that. I hear more sirens going on, than I did, let's say, a decade ago. But that's part of life when things become a little bit more urbanized, as they will. But I'm glad that Intuitive is trying to be a good neighbor, and they're trying to do what they can. They have a city manager that can empathize with people that live in the area. And you've gone through this, apparently. There are things that are going to change. It's just that we are not the 80s Paul Duke tech place that we were, and things are changing. It's a different environment. Companies are becoming more hybrid employment areas. It's going to be less footage for certain things. Certainly the thought that it was manufacturing, now that the people understand it's an assembly plant, manufacturing denotes maybe smokestacks or
waste.
A lot of Yes, clanging and all that.
You will never know there's really anything. I mean, one of the advantages is the building that they demoed to build the new assembly facility had 120-ish parking spaces adjacent to the current owners. So for decades, there have been, in the morning, cars driving in, doors slamming shut, the sound of cars starting, potentially in the winter when it was dark, headlights as the cars turn on, or even in the morning. I mean, that's being removed because there won't be any parking there. It'll be a drive aisle along that side for those smaller delivery vehicles that will drive inside the facility to unload. So they won't even be. But again, it's change. Change can be scary. Change, when you're used to something, even if the change might on paper be an improvement, you're skeptical. But I get it. All we can do as a city is hold Intuitive's feet to the fire. And I have every belief that they will do the right thing without needing that. But at the end of the day, the adjacent property owners do have a buffer that has brand new fencing, both security and an opaque privacy fence, and heavy planting inside this buffer of various heights, something that they would never have had before. So they do get something out of it. And I can't imagine when you're creating jobs with an average salary of $150,000 that there won't be some of those new Intuitive employees that wouldn't like to live right there one day anyway. Houses are up for sale.
Talking about change, just to change the subject, if you will. This is a good change that's coming, right? East Jones Bridge multi-use trail project that's beginning this week.
Yes.
That's a continuation of a project that's been ongoing through different parts of the city. And I know there's a lot of interest in that. It's good change. It's a different type of change. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the multi-use trail expansion that's going on there?
Yeah, so the section of East Jones Bridge is going to be all the way from 141 to Jones Bridge Park. So that whole length, and then it'll all be just one side of the road, just the north side of the road. And it's part of two programs, if you will. One is the city's own multi-use trail system that we're putting in the city. So we're doing that anyway. But in this particular case, it will be part of the Riverlands project. The Riverlands project, for those who don't know, is a Metro Atlanta project to have a trail system that follows the Chattahoochee the best it can from the Buford Dam all the way down to south
of the city,
west of Atlanta. It's like 100-mile system. And when I say the best you can, because of development, there are places. The back of Neely Farm is a good example. Some of the lots there, their lot line is actually the edge of the Chattahoochee, the river bank itself. Nowadays, you have to pull back off of there, and the federal government owns a much wider location on each bank. Back in the day, some of these purchases predate like the Metropolitan River Protection Act. And this is going to be a section that will get, as the Riverlands project comes down out of Johns Creek, it will end up going along 141 from the Chattahoochee, where Peachtree Corners and Johns Creek, up 141 till it gets to East Jones Bridge. And then it'll turn right. You're coming from Johns Creek, and then that Riverlands trail will take our multi-use trail and get to Jones Bridge Park. The next phase of that is a pedestrian bridge over the Chattahoochee where the old Jones Bridge itself was. And on the other side of Jones Bridge Park is the National Wildlife Refuge.
Yes, that's going to be awesome to see that.
And go along the National Wildlife Refuge until it gets to Holcomb Bridge Road.
And it's going to be a 12-foot wide concrete multi-use path.
It is. So part of our multi-use trail was also to provide a path for multiple uses. So in this case, the sidewalks put on East Jones Bridge back when the county put it in are only 3 feet wide. And so as a result, there's a lot of people who run in the road in the morning, or even kids sometimes that are riding their bike to Simpson or Pinckneyville are interacting with people on a very narrow area for both of them to interact. And so we just said, you know what? That is a good way to allow for multiple types of uses in a safe manner. So there'll be a lot safer for people to walk their dog, run, walk for exercise, or even cycle, probably with every type of cycling except, and I'll warn those who think all cyclists should be on here, when you get into the spandex crowd, as I call it, the avid cyclists, when you're averaging between 15 and 25 miles an hour,
they still have to be on the street.
Easily. You can't be on a multi-use trail. You're going to have to be on the road. So that would be the only crowd that probably you'll still see out on the road. But everybody else, including the more recreational cyclists or definitely kids cycling, they should be using this.
12 feet's wide enough to be able to accommodate pedestrians as well as, like you said, the casual cyclist. So because I'm sure people will ask, the pedestrian bridge going over the river, whose project, who's paying for it? What is the planned thing on there? Is this part city or is this something else?
I don't know. I can't answer that because we don't know. It is not a city project. That is going to take assistance all the way up to the federal government because you are now spanning a waters of the state, as it's called, a waterway. That's a big deal. You're going to have to put something in at least mid-span probably that would impede water flow. Somewhere around the bank, that's got to be looked at. So you have environmental impacts and you got to deal with all of those groups. And it'll probably be a mix of funding. I wouldn't be surprised if the city has something in it, but then the county is interested. The Riverlands project has funding. The state's interested in this, and there's a lot of federal dollars on grants for recreational amenities like this. So I actually don't think that the funding of it's going to be the problem. A pedestrian bridge over that is probably going to be in the $4 million range, plus or minus. It's not a huge amount of money. I think it's going to be getting all the regulatory,
that's where most of the work is. Yeah. So just to go through a couple of other quick things, because we're like right past where we normally go. I know that there was a groundbreaking for the town center playground. That's still on track, I think, for May something to be opened, May 18th or.
Yeah, well, so I don't know what the date. Late May is when our first big musical concert. That was our goal, is to have it in by that concert, because we know we're going to have a lot of people. We are on track to have it happen as long as two things cooperate. One is weather, when it's time to do the work. And two, maybe more important than weather in this one, is the supply chain. If we can get all of the things, because some of this playground equipment, this is not your normal playground. This is designed, fabricated, special playground stuff that you've never seen in Georgia, in the Southeast. The only one that we know of in the U.S. is in San Francisco, of the type that they're building. And so it's special. And so sometimes when you have specialty material, and it's not made here, then you run into the supply chain.
All good stuff anyway. I guess the last thing I want to ask about too, because I just saw this somewhere, is that I think the town center is getting some speed bumps, if you will, some pedestrian plateaus is what they're called, I guess.
Speed table,
Speed table, thank you. Because apparently some people can't slow down in a retail area, which is crazy because people are walking, kids might shoot out. So there's some speed tables?
Just one.
Okay.
It will actually be on, I don't even know if there's a name of that road. It's the one coming off of the roundabout, if you will, where the fountain is. Yeah. If you are coming off of the fountain, driving away from the parking deck towards Medlock, where on your right would be Firebirds, then the pet store, I think, is right after Hollywood Feeds entrance there. And on the left is the back of the parking lot for Verizon. And some of Sprouts. So that stretch, that straight line stretch before you get to the townhomes is a straight stretch. And once people clear that roundabout, they are going pretty fast. What they forget is right there at the end of the building, you've got cars coming out where Hoots was actually. Yeah, where it was. But then you also on the left is one of the ways to get to that parking lot. So you got cars coming out of a blind spot and other cars are so that's the only location it's going to go. And it'll also on the top of the table, like you said, it's a elevated crosswalk. We're basically putting to where that's also where the pedestrians would walk across right on top of that speed table.
Cool. Yeah. I think that's a great place for that, actually. That is a long stretch, and people, I think, do forget, and they're trying to get down to the roundabout, or if they're going the other way, to get to the other road on the other side. I was imagining that would happen. So we've talked about a lot of things. I do appreciate your time, Brian, for clarifying some stuff and giving us some more information about what Intuitive is doing, about the new business of what Siemens is doing as well, and to also feed on some of this other stuff that you're telling me as well. So thank you. We do this every month.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Rico.
Yeah, no, this is great. If you have any questions for Brian or any thoughts, put them into the comments. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, and if you're listening to the podcast on audio, just share that or give us a review because that's how people find us. Thank you so much. You all have a great week.
You've been listening to Prime Lunchtime with Brian Johnson, the city manager of Peachtree Corners, Georgia, with your host, Rico Figliolini. The show is part of a family of podcasts produced by Peachtree Corners Magazine and Mighty Rockets. To find more episodes of this show or our other podcasts, visit livinginpeachtreecorners.com or follow us on Facebook at Peachtree Corners Life.